Let's begin this morning with a little bit of a review. Okay, for the past several chapters, Jesus and his disciples have been making what amounts to be about a 100-mile journey from north of the Sea of Galilee all the way south, straight into the heart of Jerusalem. It's been a long trip. They've had some interesting encounters along the way. The rich young ruler, the two blind men in Jericho. And the last 15 miles or so from Jericho to Jerusalem has been especially challenging physically. It is a very long, hard climb from 800 feet below sea level to 3,000 feet above sea level. And it's all desert, right? So it's hot and it's dusty, and that's how it is most of the way until you get to the Mount of Olives, where there's not only trees and shade, but there's also a beautiful view of the city of Jerusalem. And this is where my dad picked up the story last week. Jesus and his disciples, they're sitting at the top of the Mount of Olives after this long 100-mile journey, overlooking the city of Jerusalem. And then Jesus says, okay, you two, I want you to get up. I want you to go down there. You see that village way off in the distance? I want you to go down there. You're going to find a donkey and a colt tied up next to her. I want you to get them, untie them, bring them up here to me, okay? I'm done walking, all right? So these two guys, the ones who drew the short straws or whoever they were, ended up going all the way back down the mountain immediately after they had just climbed all the way up. Pretty sure there's a sermon in there somewhere, but we'll save that for another time. And so they go into the village. They find the donkey and the colt tied up next to each other, just like Jesus said. And then these two disciples, they climb all the way back up the mountain, back up to Jesus, at which point all of the disciples take off their cloaks. They lay their cloaks onto the animals, and Jesus rides this colt that has never been ridden all the way down the mountain to the gates of Jerusalem. And as they make their way to the gates of the city, crowds of people begin to take off their cloaks as well and lay them down in front of Jesus as he rides into the city. They also take palm branches that they had cut off of trees, and they lay them down as well. And some of them start waving the branches, and they're crying out, "Hosanna to the Son of David," and "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord," because that's typically what you do when greeting a weary traveler on their way into Jerusalem, right? Wrong. There was nothing at all typical about this arrival, and that is partly, I think, what Matthew is trying to get across to us in the way that he tells this story. This is not how you treat the arrival of an average person making their entrance into the city of Jerusalem. This is how you treat a king. And if you weren't here last week and you want to hear more about this part of the story, you can go to our YouTube channel and watch the message that my dad preached last Sunday called The Coming King. So not your typical arrival, right? From the riding of a colt that's never been ridden to the cloaks being laid down on the road and the palm branches and the shouts of Hosanna, even the remarkable circumstances that led to acquiring these animals in the first place, all of this speaks to the foreknowledge and sovereignty and authority of Jesus the King. And Matthew wants us to know that that is how the disciples saw Jesus as they were making their way into Jerusalem. He's the coming King. He's the Messiah. He's the Son of David. And this is his royal reception. But Jesus' destination on this day was not just the city of Jerusalem. His destination is the temple, which is what we discover when we pick up the story this morning in chapter 21 and verse 12. And Jesus entered the temple and drove out all who sold and bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. Okay, so I want to do something this morning that my dad suggested we do last week. I want us to put ourselves into the story by trying to get into the minds of the disciples. so we can better understand what it is that's really happening. Jesus has just finished making his triumphal entry into Jerusalem with shouts of Hosanna and palm branches and cloaks that are laid at his feet as he rides through the city on the back of a colt that has never been ridden, and as he approaches the temple after this long, arduous journey of nearly 100 miles from the northern tip of the Sea of Galilee all the way into the heart of Jerusalem. Jesus dismounts the colt, he walks into the temple, and he does exactly what his disciples expected him to do, right? Not a chance. Now, I don't know what exactly the disciples were thinking when Jesus all of a sudden started taking a wrecking ball to the temple. Is he having a bad day? Has he been out in the sun too long? I mean, it has been a very long trip. But I mean, he enters the temple, which, by the way, this is something that Jesus has done many, many times over the years. It's not his first time at the temple. And so it's not like Jesus is surprised by what he sees. Oh my gosh, what are all these tables doing here? He knew they were there. He knew exactly what he was walking into. And so this is not some kind of spur-of-the-moment reaction. This was premeditated. This was planned. Jesus arrives in Jerusalem. He walks straight into the temple, and he starts to get physical. Now, to help us picture the scene a little easier, I think we have a slide that shows a model of the temple as it may have looked in Jesus' day, with the exception of probably a lot of scaffolding, because at that time the temple was under some major renovations which wouldn't be completed for another 30 years. So apart from the scaffolding, this is pretty much what the temple would have looked like. In the middle there is the sanctuary, which consists of the holy place. That's the tall building with the gold on top. The courtyard of the priests is that area that you see surrounding the immediate vicinity of the sanctuary. And then that courtyard in the front, that's the courtyard of the women. So that's as far as you could get to the sanctuary if you were a Jewish woman. And then these two huge areas on either side, that's the court of the Gentiles. And that's as close as anyone could get to the sanctuary if they weren't Jewish. So basically, those are our seats, okay? And so just to kind of add to that story as well, there was a sign that they posted on the wall that separated the court of the Gentiles from the sanctuary that said, "Foreigners enter under penalty of death," right? How's that for a church welcome table, right? And so anyway, Jesus walks into the court of the Gentiles, and all the money changers are there, and they're buying and they're selling. And so that's the area that this is all taking place, okay? And so when Jesus shows up, he targets two groups of people: the money changers, who exchanged money so people could buy temple sacrifices like lambs and birds and even things like oil and salt that were used for different kinds of sin offerings. And so Jesus went after the money changers, but he also made it a point to single out those who sold pigeons. Did you notice that? Look at verse 12 again. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. Now, pigeons, according to the Old Testament, were typically what poor people would use as a sacrifice because they couldn't afford a lamb. And so it seems that Jesus is particularly upset with people taking advantage of the poor here. And could you imagine being one of the disciples as they walk into this courtyard with Jesus? It's Passover week, so the place is even more crowded than it usually is. And then everybody's busy and they're buying and they're selling and their sacrifices. And then all of a sudden, bam, it's like pandemonium. Money's flying, tables are flying, pigeons are flying. I mean, the disciples must have been like, what is he doing now, right? Well, apparently what Jesus was doing was preaching a sermon. Look at the next verse, verse 13. He said to them, "It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of robbers. Now, the text for Jesus' sermon is taken from Isaiah chapter 56, which speaks specifically about the salvation of the Lord being extended to the Gentiles. The verse he's referring to here is in Isaiah 56 and verse 7, where God says about the Gentiles, "These I will bring to my holy mountain, and I will make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices will be accepted on my altar, for my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples." Now, usually when you hear the story of Jesus overturning the tables and the money changers, an emphasis is made on the commercialism that's happening inside the temple, right? All the buying and selling that's going on. And the point that is typically made is that the temple is supposed to be a house of prayer, not a house of commerce. And so what Jesus is doing is he's, quote, cleansing the temple of all of this secular commercialism so that the true purpose of the temple can be restored, and that purpose, of course, is prayer. In fact, your Bible may even title this section, "The Cleansing of the Temple," or "Jesus Cleanses the Temple," or something along those lines. But see, the problem with that description, that title, is that is not what Jesus is doing here. This isn't a protest that Jesus is engaged in to try and clean up the temple and reform the temple. This is judgment. This isn't cleansing the temple. This is judging the temple. And he's judging it for its hypocrisy. He's judging it because although the temple looks very impressive, it's not fulfilling the purpose that it was designed for. Like a fruit tree that doesn't have any fruit. The tree looks healthy from a distance. Similarly, the temple looks healthy. It's beautifully built, it's bustling with activity, but it has no fruit. In fact, that's actually a really good illustration of where the temple is at this point. A tree with no fruit. Hold that thought. We'll come back to it in just a minute. But for now, let's get back to the temple. The temple may look pretty impressive from the outside, but inside, well, Jesus says in verse 13 that it is like a den of robbers. Now, Jesus was quoting from the prophet Isaiah when he referenced the temple being a house of prayer, but now when he speaks of it as being a den of robbers, he's quoting from the prophet Jeremiah, where God says to his people in chapter 7, "Will you steal, murder, commit adultery, swear falsely, make offerings to Baal and go after other gods that you have not known, and then come and stand before me in this house, which is called by my name, and say, 'We are delivered'?" Or another way you could say it is, "We are forgiven"? Only to go on doing all of these abominations? Has this house, which is called by my name, become a den of robbers in your eyes? In other words, what God is saying to his people is this: do you seriously think you can get away with that? Do you seriously think that you can lie and steal and commit adultery and then come in here once a week and offer some kind of sacrifice and then go right out there living exactly the way you were living before and think that somehow I'm going to be okay with that? What do you think this place is? A safe house for criminals? See, that's what a den of robbers really means. It's got nothing at all to do with money. Because, think about it. Robbers don't steal in their own den. What do there? They hide, right? They take refuge in the den. This isn't about money. It's about hypocrisy. It's about living like the world out there and expecting to find refuge in here when all you're going to do is keep living the way you're living when you get back out there again. When Jesus says, you've turned my Father's house into a den of robbers, he's not just talking about the buying and the selling that's going on inside the temple. He's talking about a religious system that makes people think that they can live however they want to live as long as they exchange some money, pay a temple tax, and burn a pigeon. And Jesus comes in and he says, listen up, people, this ain't working. It may look great on the outside, but on the inside, there is no fruit. And so what does Jesus do? Jesus brings the fruit, verse 14. And the blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he healed them. Talk about a good sermon illustration. Here's the presence of God healing the sick and giving sight to the blind in the courtyard of the Gentiles. All of a sudden, they're the best seats in the house, aren't they? Because that's where Jesus is, and that's where the fruit is. But not everybody liked this new arrangement, as we see next in verse 15. But when the chief priests and the scribes saw the wonderful things that he did, and the children crying out in the temple, Hosanna to the Son of David, they were indignant. And they said to him, do you hear what these are saying? And Jesus said to them, yes. Have you never read? Out of the mouths of infants and nursing babies, you have prepared praise. And leaving them, he went out of the city to Bethany and lodged there. So while all of this hypocritical worship is taking place in the temple, Jesus is having his own worship service out here in the court of the Gentiles, healing the blind and the lame, while a children's choir is singing Hosanna to the Son of David. And the chief priests and the scribes are indignant. They can't stand it. Who ever heard of someone getting upset by a children's choir? I mean, you have to be pretty far gone for that to happen. Trust me, when our children's choir comes and sings in a couple weeks, I mean, you are going to love it. It will bring a smile to your face. And if it doesn't, well, then I guess you're a scribe or a Pharisee. Because those guys couldn't stand it. And why couldn't they stand it? Because they saw what was happening. They knew what all of this meant. And they are scared to death. Because if the people start to believe that Jesus, the Son of David, is more relevant than the temple is, they are out of a job. See, as long as people think that they need a religious system in order to have a right relationship with God, then those who run the system profit from it. But if you destroy the system and you tell people that there is another way to be right with God, namely by grace alone, through faith alone in the Son of David, in Jesus himself, well, then the temple all of a sudden becomes irrelevant. Which is why the religious leaders who worked in the temple were indignant toward Jesus, not because he came to cleanse the temple, not because he came to give it a makeover, but because he came to put an end to it. And that's where our next story fits in, the story of the tree. See, Jesus didn't come to reform the temple. He came to expose it and to show us a better way. And the story of the fig tree just drives that point home. Take a look here beginning in verse 18. In the morning, as he was returning to the city, Jesus became hungry. And seeing a fig tree by the wayside, he went to it and found nothing on it but only leaves. And he said to it, "May no fruit ever come from you again." And the fig tree withered at once. When the disciples saw it, they marveled, saying, "How did the fig tree wither at once?" And Jesus answered them, "Truly I say to you, if you have faith and do not doubt, You will not only do what has been done to the fig tree, but even if you say to this mountain, and I believe that Jesus was pointing to the Temple Mount when he said these words, and I'll explain why in just a minute. But even if you say to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, it will happen. And whatever you ask in prayer, you will receive if you have faith. Okay, so what in the world is going on here? Anybody here ever read this story before? Has it confused you as much as it has me? May no fruit ever come from you again. Okay. Let's just break this down for a second. It's the next morning. Jesus and his disciples, they're on their way back to the temple. And along the way, Jesus sees a fig tree. Now, the tree looks healthy from a distance because it's got all of these green leaves on it. But when Jesus walks over toward the tree to get something to eat, he finds nothing but leaves. And so he curses the tree and he says, may no fruit ever come from you again. And then immediately the tree died. It withered right before their eyes. Now, there's a couple things that put us at a disadvantage, I think, when it comes to understanding this story. First would be our lack of knowledge when it comes to Middle Eastern horticulture, okay? Mark, in his gospel, points out that it wasn't the season for figs. So why would Jesus go looking for figs if it wasn't the right time of year for that? Well, apparently fig trees in that part of the world go through a couple stages of fruit production. Who knew? And although ripe figs aren't ready until late spring, green figs develop early in the spring, right around the time of Passover, which of course is when this story takes place. And although green figs aren't typically considered ripe enough to eat, some locals have developed a taste for them. And so eating a green fig isn't necessarily unheard of. I'm sure Jesus ate plenty of green figs while he was growing up. And so the point is there should at least be some green figs on this tree. But a lack of knowledge about fig trees isn't the only thing that puts us at a disadvantage here. A lack of knowledge about Old Testament prophecy also doesn't help. See, because both the disciples in this story and the people Matthew was writing to back then would have been familiar with the fact that the fig tree was often used as a symbol to describe Israel's status before God. We see examples of that in the book of Jeremiah and Micah and Joel. And we also see the destruction of the fig tree pointing toward God's judgment on Israel in the prophetic books of Isaiah and Hosea. So all that to say, the original readers of this story would have recognized the significance of the fig tree right away. See, the story of the fig tree has a lot less to do with Jesus being disappointed after not being able to find a snack, and a lot more to do with Jesus teaching his disciples something more about why he has come to Jerusalem, what he has come to accomplish. In other words, just like Jesus used the turning over the tables and the healing of the blind and the lame in the courtyard and the children singing songs of praise to Jesus in the courtyard, just like Jesus used all of those things as sermon illustrations the day before, again, Jesus is using this fig tree as an illustration to show his disciples there is a new priest in town, a new mediator between God and man. Where before the temple acted as a mediator between God and man, now that system is no longer necessary. The temple, in other words, is like a withered tree. And Jesus has come to take an axe to that tree once and for all. In fact, in chapter 24, Jesus will say about the temple that not one stone will be left upon another, which is true of the temple itself, as it'll be destroyed by the Romans 40 years later, but it's also true of Jesus himself. His body, his temple, will also be destroyed and then raised again in 3 days. Only this time it won't be a temple made of hands, and the blood of animals won't be used as a sacrifice for sin, but instead, Jesus' own blood will be spilled to forgive us of our sins and to make a way for all people, both Jews and Gentiles, to be in God's presence once and for all. In fact, at that exact moment, the moment of Jesus' death, and we'll see this when we get to chapter 27, at that exact moment when Jesus dies, there is a giant earthquake. And the curtain in the temple that separated the Holy of Holies from the rest of the sanctuary, so the curtain that separated us from the presence of God, that curtain is torn in two from top to bottom. And at that same moment, a Roman centurion, a Gentile, who never in his life came close to the Holy of Holies, will stand at the cross along with his Roman buddies, and filled with awe, they will make this declaration of faith: truly, this was the Son of God. As Jesus extends forgiveness from the cross, these men are given the faith to believe that Jesus is the Son of God. That's why Jesus sums all of this up to his disciples at the end of the story in verse 22 by simply saying, wherever you are and whatever you ask, simply have faith and believe. It doesn't matter anymore where you pray. It doesn't even matter if you're a Gentile and you can't get a front row seat near the Holy of Holies. God's not there anymore. You don't have to go to the temple to pray. Jesus says, whenever you cry out to God, whenever you pray, all you have to do is pray in faith. You don't need a religious system to negotiate with God on your behalf. All you need is faith. Faith that is made available to us in Jesus alone. See, Jesus didn't come to reform religion. He didn't come to cleanse it and to make it better. He came to judge it and to make it obsolete, so that our relationship with God from now on is by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone, who forgives us from the cross and who gives us the faith to believe. Amen? Amen. Let's have the worship team come back up, and we're going to take a few minutes to respond this morning.